All right, so our next unit is biology. So far we've covered physics and chemistry and now biology. So the first thing we need to look at with biology are cells. So why cells? Well, cells are the basic unit of life. So in order to be considered alive, you need to be made out of cells. Whether it's a single cell or multiple cells, you have to at least be made up of one cell. And all things that are alive are composed of cells. So you can see here what I've got. I've got red blood cells. These are plant cells up here from a green plant. These are, I believe, onion cells that have been dyed, and I didn't notice this when I put the picture in, but the picture I borrowed is actually of a bag that somebody designed. So people even think that these just look cool. So one of the things that we do know is not only are all living things composed of cells, but all of the cells today that are in existence came from dividing pre-existing cells. So the cells just don't appear out of anywhere. Every cell that we have came from a cell that was already in existence through cell division. So why can't we just see cells? Well, cells are incredibly small. The reason for this is because actually their surface area. So if they get too big, let me grab a pen. So let me draw a couple cells real quick. So we've got that guy and this guy. This cell is going to do much better than this cell. And that's because this cell has more surface area to its volume than this one does. So think about it this way. If you need supplies, you have more places to be able to ship those supplies in from if you're this small cell, and you don't have to supply as much because you don't have as much stuff inside that you need to give food and nutrients and all of that stuff to. Versus this big guy, there's not as many entry points to bring stuff in and send stuff out. And there's a much bigger area that needs food and nutrients. Okay, so that's why cells are so small. Now, there are exceptions. So we can see a few types of individual cells with our naked eye. And you can see those up here. And the most common ones are eggs. So an unfertilized chicken egg is one of the biggest individual cells you can see. The absolute biggest cell that would be an individual cell that you could see with your naked eye today would be an ostrich egg that isn't fertilized. They don't get any bigger than that. Once though, those eggs are fertilized, they start to divide and they would be made out of multiple smaller cells. Frog eggs, same thing. If you can find an unfertilized frog egg, that would be a single cell, but once it's fertilized, it starts to divide into smaller cells. But what do you need to see most individual cells, right? And that's what we have marked over here. You're going to need some sort of microscope. Now, depending on what it is that you're looking at, depends on what kind of microscope you're going to need. So if you're just looking at things like regular plant and animal cells, like the ones on the slide before, you can just use a regular light microscope. So there are some that actually have been made to attach to cell phones that you can use to do this. Or these are the normal microscopes that you're used to seeing like in a science lab, things like that. So these are just going to use regular light. And remember when we talked about atoms in the chemistry chapter, atoms are too small to see with the naked eye because light rays are too spaced apart. Well, they're not too spaced apart in order to see these kinds of cells. So we can see plant and animal cells, and we can see most bacteria with a light microscope. Depending on the cell, you might be able to see what we call a mitochondrion. That is one of the parts of the cell that would be inside of a plant or an animal cell. But you need a pretty powerful microscope in order to see these kinds of structures. In order to see a lot of this stuff, like the smaller stuff like bacteria and interior cell parts, down to things like viruses, and then individual particles like ribosomes, proteins, and then things like those atom and molecule pictures I showed you in the chemistry chapter, we're going to need an electron microscope. Electron microscopes do kind of what they sound like. They shoot electrons. They shoot a beam of electrons at the material and build the picture based on those electrons bouncing off. So we need those electron microscopes in order to see the small stuff. That's why we didn't know about things like viruses until more recently, because we needed this technology in order to actually view them because they're so tiny. All right, so how do we classify a cell? So one of the first things we're going to do is break them into one or the other of these groups. So you're either going to belong to the prokaryotes or what we call the eukaryotes. So we're going to look at the prokaryotes first. So if you're a prokaryote, you're going to have a rigid cell wall surrounding a membrane. So if we draw one of these guys out, so you're going to have a rigid shape on the outside, and then just on the inside of that, let's change color to, yeah, we'll switch to gray. So just on the inside of that is going to be a cell membrane. So the cell membrane works, and we'll see more of this, it works kind of like a Ziploc bag. A lot of stuff stays in, so it holds the material into the cell, but it does allow some stuff to leak out. So you're going to have most of these prokaryotes with this kind of rigid structure for its shape, and then a cell membrane on the inside to hold all of the contents of the cell in. The DNA, so they have genetic information in the form of DNA, but it's going to be packaged up in circular chromosomes. So the chromosomes are just how we chop up the genetic information. So if we're talking about chromosomes, these guys are going to make theirs into big circles, and we'll see that's different from the other type of cells. So they're going to pack it into circular chromosomes. There's no nucleus. So the DNA isn't stored in a prokaryote. It is just kind of floating out here in the cell. It might be a full circle, or it actually might look more like this. It's actually still a circle. It's just a big loop that's been kind of knotted around. But this is still the DNA, not inside of any sort of enclosure. And these guys may have things like flagella. So flagella are tails, and so they may have a tail or two, or maybe even three, and they are going to use these to move around. All right, so that's a prokaryote. If you're not a prokaryote, what are you? Well, you're a eukaryote. U for true, and the karyo means nucleus. Okay, so if we go back to the picture over here, pro means before. So prokaryote, before a nucleus appeared. Eukaryote means true, or these guys have a nucleus. So who are we talking about? Well, these guys, let me get rid of my little prokaryote. These guys have cell membranes, so they have that same structure, to that kind of Ziploc bag to hold everything in. Some of them have cell walls. This one. So our fungi and our plants have cell walls, but what makes them different from our prokaryotes is they actually are made out of different materials. So even though they still have that structure that gives them shape like a prokaryote, they're all going to make them out of different materials. And so that's one of the ways we can tell these guys apart. All right, what else makes a eukaryote? So the DNA is packaged in linear chromosomes in the nucleus. So if we had a eukaryotic cell, we would have a nucleus, and then our chromosomes are going to be linear, so strings basically, packaged up inside of it. Okay, so very different from a prokaryote. These guys are also going to contain organelles. So organelle means little organ. So they kind of have their own organ system. So these are specialized sections in the cell that do different jobs. So they have things like chloroplast in plants, mitochondria in all of them. So mitochondria are important for energy, and a lot of other different ones. The nucleus is considered an organelle because it's storing DNA. So that's kind of an overview of cells. What we're going to be looking at for this first section is mainly the cell membrane and how things move across it, because that's really important when we get into talking about things like how nerves work and how those are tied into our senses, which is a big part of what we're going to be talking about here in the biology chapter.